Bismillah, we keep it moving right here with the next section. Imam Buhuti rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, وَتَجِبُ فِيهِمَا التَّسْمِيَةُ مَعَ ذِكْرِ فَيَنْوِي عِنْدَهَا أَوْ قَبْلَهَا بِيَسِيرٍ رَفْعَ الْحَدَثِ أو الطهارة للصلاة مثلا وإن نوى ما يسن له كقراءة وأذان ورفع شك وغضب أو نوى التجديد ناسيا حدثه أو الغسل لنحو جمعة أو عيد ارتفع حدثه وإن تنوعت أحداث فنوى أحدها ارتفع كلها. Here we're talking about some important issues pertaining to the tasmiyah and the niyyah, the intention, the utterance of the basmalah, to say Bismillah, as well as the intention. Imam al-Buhuti says it is obligatory in both, referring to wudu and ghusl. This also includes tayammum, by the way. If remembered, we're talking about the tasmiyah. If remembered, which means that if you forget the tasmiyah, it's foregone. It's voided. Wudu is still valid. If you complete your wudu and then you remembered, oh, I forgot the tasmiyah, you're fine. But if you know and are cognizant and aware that you have to say the tasmiyah, you remember it, and you intentionally refrain from doing so, and then you make wudu, it's invalid. If in the middle of the purification process, making wudu, etc., you remember you forgot it, according to what's in Muntal Iradat, you stop, you say the tasmiyah, fulfill that obligation, and you begin again, you start over. So the tasmiyah is something that's uttered, it's actually said, it's pronounced, it's not something that's just like mentioned in your mind or in your heart. Of course, this is based on the hadith, that there is no wudu without the mentioning of Allah's name. It's collected by Imam Ahmad. Of course, this is obligatory before the first obligation and recommended before the first recommendation. Now in wudu, we're going to learn that the prophetic practice and description is that you begin with a recommendation. So it's recommended here to say the tasmiyah before that. But you're obliged to say it before the first obligation of the wudu. And we'll see that shortly in a more detailed description. At which or shortly before, at which meaning the tasmiyah, at which or shortly before the tasmiyah, even if it's separated by a short period of time, an intention to eliminate a hadith or purify for prayer, for example, is to be made. So meaning that even if you intended shortly before you began your wudu, if it's a short amount of time before you begin, you made the intention, a short amount of time goes by, it's still valid. The intention is still intact. Okay? That's what he's basically saying here in this line. And this can be coupled, by the way, with another intention, like to cool off or to clean oneself or to teach another person by way of example, because these secondary intentions do not invalidate the primary intention of eliminating a hadith or performing it for prayer, etc., some other act of worship which either requires purification or purification is recommended to do it to perform that act. And so basically, you can have a multitude of intentions going on here so long as the intention does not undermine what it is that you're trying to do. And we'll talk about an example of that and what that looks like shortly. So basically, this intention is to be made in the heart, though it is recommended to utter it silently on the tongue in support of the intention, even if what's said on the tongue is an actual mistake. And that goes to further show that the intention, that which is considered as what is in the heart, that the tongue is there in support, so that they're both in conjunction. Imam al-Buhuti goes on and he says, it will eliminate one's hadith if an intention is made for what is recommended, such as recitation, the adhan, eliminating doubt due to a minor hadith, or anger, or an intention to renew it while forgetting an actual hadith. So there's a couple of things to talk about here. Talking about making wudu in order to perform something for which wudu is recommended, not obligated. So prayer, as he mentions initially in the text, to make wudu or to eliminate, he says the intention is either raf al-hadath or al-tahara, purification for prayer mathalan. So we know that prayer, regardless of the nature of prayer, whether it's obligatory or voluntary, you have to make wudu. You have to be in a state of purity. Okay? But there are other things that he mentions, the examples, reciting the Quran. We're not talking about touching the mushaf. We're talking about reciting the Quran. It's recommended to be in a state of purity, to make wudu from a minor hadath. To make the adhan, it's recommended to make wudu from a minor hadath. And also to eliminate doubt, where you made wudu, but you're uncertain if you have eliminated that due to a hadith. I know I made wudu, I'm just not sure if I broke my wudu. And so there's some doubt there. In order to remove that doubt, it's recommended that you make wudu, even though you're not obliged to do it. Or due to anger, he says. Anger is also an instance in which it is recommended to make wudu. Anger is from shaitan, and this was recommended by the Prophet ﷺ when angered to make wudu. So essentially, you're making wudu for an action that doesn't require wudu, but recommends it. And if that was the intention, it will eliminate a hadith. And therefore, you can use that same wudu to perform an action which requires wudu, like prayer. He also mentions another thing, which is tajdeed al-wudu, nasiyan hadatha. Basically, you're going to renew your wudu, though you forgot you have to make wudu due to a hadith. And this is associated with prayer. Tajdeed al-wudu is associated with prayer. Why is that? Because the recommended tajdeed, renewal of wudu, is done after having prayed. So basically, you make wudu, and then you pray, and then you make wudu again in preparation for the next prayer. And then if you pray, you make wudu again for the next prayer after that. It's essentially like you're making wudu again because you already used the previous wudu for the prayer. So it's like, I want to make a fresh wudu for every prayer, even though I'm not obliged to do it because I didn't break my wudu. But in this example, you actually did, but you forgot. So basically, like you're making wudu for something legislated while having forgotten that you're actually obliged to do it. So is that sufficient or not in the event that you forgot about the hadith? And basically the short answer is yes, it is. As long as you forgot and you made the intention while having forgotten the hadith, not if you know that you made a hadith and you're like, I'm just going to make tajdeed al-wudu. This isn't tajdeed anymore, right? Knowing that you made a hadith is not tajdeed. If I knew I made a hadith, then I'm not actually making tajdeed al-wudu. I'm making wudu. Okay, but here, in order for it to be considered valid, you have to have forgotten that hadith because you have intended tajdeed. And so if that's the case, then it will be a valid purification, as opposed to having known that you made a hadith and intended tajdeed. It wouldn't be a valid purification. And the evidence for this tajdeed being legislated and recommended is the Prophet ﷺ saying, if it weren't for the difficulty that I would place upon my ummah, I would order them to make wudu before every prayer. One narration, this is obviously collected by Imam Ahmad. One narration, he used the word amara, and another narration, he used the word farada. So one is to command and one is to obligate. And so we understand that the intention was to make it wajib. He was going to make it wajib, but explained why he did not. It was not legislated as an obligation, and so it wasn't elevated to that status, but was now a recommendation, much like the siwak. There's another hadith that's similar to that. If it wasn't for the difficulty upon my ummah, then I would have commanded them to use the siwak before every prayer. It's not an obligation to use the siwak before prayer, but it is, however, a recommendation, much like tajdeed al-wudu in this case. So that's what the evidence is used to support the legislated recommended nature of tajdeed al-wudu. meaning that you have prayed and then you're going to make wudu again, even though it's not required for the next prayer. So yes, essentially, if that's the scenario, the wudu is valid and you can continue performing, prayer or whatever else. Another thing is to perform ghusl or jum'ah, to perform ghusl for jum'ah or Eid, meaning the ghusl for jum'ah or Eid in and of themselves is not an obligation, that's a recommendation. But you have to make ghusl for an obligation, right? For prayer. Like you have to do that, like you are in a state of ritual impurity. You don't have to be in a state of ritual impurity to make the ghusl for Jum'ah or for Eid. You don't have to be in a major state of ritual impurity. You can do that as a recommendation. But in this case, you actually are in a state of major ritual impurity, so you're obliged to do so in order to eliminate that major hadith. But if you're intending to make the ghusl for the sake of Eid prayer, it will be valid and it will eliminate the hadith. If you're making ghusl with the intention to go pray Jummah prayer, it will eliminate the hadith, even though it was a ghusl which is recommended, not one that is obligatory, while you are actually obliged to make the ghusl. This is also the case if you simply want to remain in a constant state of purification, if that's the intention, not like tajdeed al-wudu, but just wanting to be in purification all of the time, as has been mentioned in Ash-Sharh al-Kabir. Essentially, right, if you're like, what's going on? I might have to re-listen to that a couple times to grasp it if the issue's not clear. The essence of this is that purification done for a legislated reason will suffice a required purification, right? And we have to remember some of the scenarios that applies to. If they were to intend both the obligatory for ghusl, for example, both the removal of janaba, or like I have to make a ghusl, for janaba, but I also want to go for Eid. I mean, I'm obliged to make ghusl because of the janaba, this sexual impurity. But if you make the intention for both, for that and to pray and for Eid, the sunniyatul al-ghusl al-Eid, like the recommended ghusl. So I'm intending to make the obligatory ghusl and the recommended ghusl together because of its Eid and because I have to do it for prayer, then inshallah you will be rewarded for both those intentions, essentially. It says if there are different types of hadiths, even if they occurred at different times. Okay, like, you passed wind and then you used the restroom, you urinated and then you defecated and then you touched your spouse, something that invalidated your wudu. And we'll look at some of those examples later on when we get to that chapter of invalidations of purification. If all of those things happen and then you intended to eliminate only one of them, remember, the nature of this is important because we're talking about how the intention is made. It's either made for an act to do something or it's made to eliminate something. You're either intending to eliminate something or you're intending to do something. So if the intention now is to eliminate something and you've done like 5 or 6 things which would technically require you to make wudu and you intend only one of those things, it will be sufficient for all of them. It will eliminate all of them. So long as you did not intend to eliminate that one thing alone. As long as you did not intend to eliminate only that one hadith. Okay, so if you said, I am going to make wudu only to remove the time that I passed wind, but forget about those 5 or 6 other things that I did between now and then. If that's the case, then yeah, you still have to make wudu because you're not, you haven't achieved a state of purity. You just eliminated one hadith. You still have the 5 or 6 that were committed. Okay? So long as you don't intend to eliminate only that one individual hadith, eliminating one will suffice all of the others. It's also important to note that if this is what Ibn Qaid mentions, and you'll find this in other works, like Imam al-Buhuti mentions this in Sharh al-Muntaha. He says, should be noted, however, that if one in a state of sexual impurity were to intend ghusl for the sole purpose of removing the major state of ritual impurity and not the minor state as well, then the major state will be removed, but the minor state will not be, and therefore you need to make wudu. Or if they intended to make ghusl to simply pass through the masjid. That's not the case. You're not legislated to make a ghusl to pass through the masjid, because it's not legislated, it wouldn't count for anything. And if you constricted your intention just to remove the major state of ritual impurity while you were also in a state of minor ritual impurity, basically means like, I'm in a state of sexual impurity, right? I was intimate with my spouse, and I also went to the restroom and passed wind, etc., right? Then, if your intention for ghusl was to eliminate a hadith, then all of it would be removed. But if it was, I'm only going to make ghusl for the sexual activity, then that's removed. The rest of them are not. Now I need to make wudu with that as well. So basically, if you wish to suffice yourself with a ghusl for both major and minor ritual impurity, the intention should be to generally remove all of the hadith, both the major and the minor, and not simply the major alone. And that will conclude this section.